A recent report by independent Russian media has concluded that hundreds of millions of dollars worth of restricted Western electronics have found their way to Russia this year, despite sanctions meant to prevent that. Now, at least some of that tech is going into Russian weapons that then hit Ukraine. DW's Nick Connolly takes a closer look.
This is what just one Russian missile can do. Here in the city of Uman in April, the KH-101 cruise missile killed 24 people in this apartment block. Just one of thousands of missiles Russia has used so far in this war. Andriy Rudik shows us how they work. His Ukrainian army unit analyzes Russian weapon systems. This is the KH-101 missile's onboard computer, its brain.
All of this is imported, none of it is Russian. You can seize it from the way it's been put together. There is nothing Russian here except the mounting, the markings, and the serial number.
Rudik won't point the finger, but researchers have identified chips from companies, including US-based Texas Instruments and Germany's Infineon, amongst other household names. This kit was supposed to be stopped by sanctions, but a year and a half into the war, Russia is still getting these chips, often via new routes they want to keep secret.
The Russians know that our center and others are watching what they do. They've started filing off the serial number on chips in weapon systems we've shot down more recently. They're trying to make it harder to work out what they're using. Before, like here, you could see everything.
Russia needs to keep this Western technology flowing to its weapons manufacturers. It's been using up missiles faster than anyone had expected.
These missiles are going straight from the factory to the front. There is no time even for tests. We shoot down missiles that have been built the same months.
If sanctions loopholes were actually closed, Ukraine's missile defense forces say they'd see the difference in a matter of months. Independent Russian journalists in exile have seen secret customs statistics which show ballooning imports from third countries as Moscow scrambles to source electronics. Many sellers might not even realize their chips are being used for war, says Gary Somerville, a research fellow at the Royal United Services Institute, a British think tank.
The vast majority, as we see, something like, say, the KH-101 and a number of other Russian weapon systems are essentially commercial chips that you can buy off the shelf.
These chips are found in cars, medical devices, and even consumer electronics. Most aren't considered to be military grade, so aren't subject to the toughest export controls.
What particularly note is actually sort of seemingly microchips are now considered obsolete, but of course are still perfectly capable of being used inside a number of the Russian weapon systems.
Most chips being put into weapons like these reach Russia from Hong Kong and China through a complex web of intermediaries and shell companies. And when rule breakers are caught and sanctioned, new routes open up almost straight away.
There's no magic bullet solution to the issue of sort of starving Russia of microelectronics and needs. And essentially, this is going to be like an ongoing intelligence issue that has to be consistently managed. So yes, okay, they can get it, but they're going to have to pay a lot more money for it. Our team here at RUSI is like 6 people, and we've been able to establish all of those connections and understand how it's working. So with a large multinational microelectronics manufacturers can replicate what our methodologies, like I say, because it's all open source.
And until things change, Ukraine is going to see more devastating attacks. This is the missile graveyard in Kharkiv. And these are just some of the missiles Russia has fired at Ukraine's second city since war began.
This is what a year and a half of sleepless nights and air raid sirens looks like in Kharkiv. Behind every missile, behind every shell here, there's a life that at best has been upended and at worst been cut short.
Ukrainian investigators are examining these missiles, trying to find out who gave the orders to fire them and who pushed the button. But as for the people who made these attacks possible by providing Russia the parts, for now, at least, it seems they have little to fear.
Let's get more into this now with Sarah Stewart. She's in Washington, D.C., a trade policy expert and the CEO of Silverado, a tech policy group. Welcome to the program, Sarah. We just heard that report about Western tech, microchips in particular, getting into Russian weapons. Does that information jibe with what you're seeing?
Yes, actually, it does. And I think what's really interesting to point out here is that Russia's adaptation to the sanctions has been an easier lift than the enforcement of those sanctions. At Silverado, we looked specifically at public export data from almost every country in the world so that we could corroborate it and talk about it and not have to explain, a particular methodology. And what was stunning about the statistics that we've laid out in our report is that while it was very expected to see a steep decline in everyone's exports to Russia following the invasion and following the unprecedented coordinated set of sanctions by 37 countries, we started to see an uptick in imports, in Russia's imports starting last summer and continuing until today, where we now see pre-war levels are being met, but the actors are different. So now we see China and Hong Kong stepping in, and these are in key technology areas, whether you're talking about smartphones or semiconductor chips, vehicle parts, aerospace, and others.
So how do we assess the sanctions that, as you say, are unprecedented and incredibly well coordinated, and yet this is still happening? Would you say the sanctions against Russia are failing?
I wouldn't say that they're failing. I think that they have had an impact, but I think that they are very difficult to enforce, even with best efforts. The U.S. government has been partnering with allies and other key partners on enforcement efforts. We're seeing a lot of great work that's being done, but this is a highly complex, very opaque network of distributors. And, as the segment pointed out, we're seeing chips from companies that we know are not exporting directly to Russia anymore, still ending up there through this network. The enforcement is something that we just have to keep doubling down on. We have to stay ahead of Russia's adaptation to new sources.
So that's the trade aspect of this. Let's look at the tech aspect of it, because, of course, microchips is a huge sector, means a lot of things. Just how vital is this kind of Western technology to Russian weapon production and its ability to prosecute its war in Ukraine?
Well, the data that we've looked at does not tell you exactly where these chips are going once they get to Russia. So it's hard to say, with any conclusory statement that the Russian military is for sure using it. But what we can say is that we know that these chips are being made available and very accessible. And given that they have both civilian and military uses, and that they are absolutely central to all sorts of military capabilities, such as satellite communications and weapon systems, one can assume that they are getting to military end users.
All right, Sarah Stewart, thank you very much for those insights from the Silverado Group.
Thank you.
Our Brussels correspondent Teri Schultz has been following this story as well. Teri, there are Western sanctions on technology going to Russia. Are they working?
That's true, and they're clearly not working well enough. Nonetheless, the EU does believe, Gerhard, that sanctions are an important part of what they call their toolbox to curb Russia's ability to wage war on Ukraine. But that seems to be primarily by reducing the amount of money he has to spend on weapons and on spare parts, which are also under sanctions. We do know that last year, for example, the Russian economy shrunk by about 2%, and it's expected to contract even further this year with, of course, the cutoff in most trade with Russia. But obviously, the Kremlin is finding ways to skirt those sanctions with the help of Western companies, and that's something that obviously needs to change.
Now, you mentioned that these sanctions have loopholes benefiting Moscow. What can the EU do? What should the EU do about that?
the EU does recognize that this is a huge problem and that, a lot of other measures they're taking will be ineffective if Russia can continue to get around these sanctions and procure these components for their weapons. So they're doing a few things. I mean, they can't just completely cut off trade with some of these countries that are re-exporting to Moscow. And some of those are surprising characters, by the way. Turkey, a NATO member, is re-exporting a lot to Moscow. Georgia, a country with part of its territory occupied by Moscow. So you would think that these countries would be very careful about what they send on to Russia, but it seems that, business is ruling the day here. So what the EU is looking at doing, and this was part of its last sanctions package passed in June, is by sanctioning directly the companies that are making the sales to Russia. You can't cut off trade with a country, but you can definitely impinge on a company's ability to do so. The other thing they're doing is by prohibiting the transit of some items across Russian territory, even to different end users. That way they can be more certain that Vladimir Putin can't get his hands on these items.
Now, from a defense perspective, how important is Western technology for Russia's military?
It's hugely important. I read a survey by the London-based think tank RUSI that said that there are 450 critical components in Russia's high-tech weaponry that are sourced from abroad. So you see that they're very dependent on that if they're going to continue waging war at the level they're doing now. And so it's obviously very important for companies to stop selling these weapons. And as you heard from the Ukrainians in Nick Connolly's piece, they believe that if these were choked off, these supplies to Russia's military machinery, the Ukrainians would feel a difference in a very short time on the battlefield. But it's going to be up to these companies to make that moral decision because there are always going to be ways to skirt the sanctions.
DW's Brussels correspondent Teri Schultz there for us. Thank you very much, Teri.